Silva with us this evening. He's a emeritus professor at the College of Marin. Many of you, I'm sure, know him. I myself have taken Paul's field botany of Marin County some years ago, where we discussed plant communities of Marin. He's taught biology and natural history and environmental science and environmental landscaping. And Paul is currently an elected member of the board of the College of Marin. He's been active with the Marin Chapter for many years. He's currently serving on the board, and he leads field trips and handles our scholarship program. And he was instrumental in the creation of a new docent program at Ring Mountain Preserve, which is a partnership between Marin County Parks and Open Space and Marin CNPS. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been a pleasure to work with you these many years, and I hope that all will derive some enjoyment from this presentation tonight. I have to remind everybody that it is sort of a condensation of classes I taught over the years. Dave reminded me that I hadn't taught a class during the course on Marin botany. I had this one class on plant communities in Marin, and that was just the introduction to the rest of the semester. And the rest of the semester then filled in all the rest of the communities over the course of 15 weeks. So I'm going to try to give you what I might call synoptic snippets of the rest of the semester, so as not to have you here for, say, 15 hours. So if I go a little quickly, please bear with me, and then we'll be able to deal with questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll show some pictures. Here we go. Let's see. All right. Oops. There. And we go. Let's see. Okay, so this is the class that the title of the class that I taught in the course that was called is still called, in fact, Biology 116 or Field Botany of Marin. I should add that this course is still being taught. It's still part of the Natural History Certificate program at the College of Marin that within about 2 years or so of coursework educates people to all of what one of my colleagues would call all the ologies. I guess botany doesn't really have an ology, but there's marine biology and there's entomology and all these other things there too. So if any of you have your interest piqued by this presentation, please search out the course in the future. It's usually given once every 2 years, every second spring. Okay, so what we let's see here. Oops. What I'd like to do is to start with is this big planet Earth. And of course, this is the planet we all share. And from the point of view of life, all the parts of the planet Earth that are alive or where living things reside are called the biosphere. And so it's nice to start off this way, because the traditional way that biologists organize living things on Earth starts with the biosphere as the biggest scale, and then proceeds down all the way to the, I guess, subatomic particles, which you can't see, but you're not supposed to be able to see subatomic particles, right? And the community is here at the large, sort of towards the upper end, in between the biosphere and the biome. We'll get a little more into that in a minute or so. And so let's think here about how each level differs from the level above it and the level below it, and what it actually is. Each level is thought of as a system that's composed of parts of the next lowest level that are arranged in a particular way, and they interact with each other in particular ways. And each level has some emergent properties, in other words, some properties that stick out that are not found in the next lowest level. The most famous example is the example of the cell, which is composed of molecules. The molecules are non-living, and they're put together in certain ways. They do certain things together, and they produce the emergent property of life. And so the cell is living and the molecules are non-living. Now, we go out to the world around us here in Marin, and we see these things we call plants. I guess those are plants, right? Okay. And we find that they're grouped in different ways. And one of the first things that ecologists began to do is to figure out, could they describe the groupings? And way back at the beginning of, I know my ecology studies, there are these three possibilities that were presented. Are the plants uniformly distributed, randomly distributed, or clumped? And then how can we describe the patterns a little more carefully? And then what are the reasons behind these patterns? Ecological reasons. And then the big question we'll get to more at the end is, do these patterns actually transcend the individual plants? So the basic ideas, oops, let me go back here. The basic idea is that you could have a uniform grouping, but probably if you're not in an orchard or vineyard, you're not going to have a uniform grouping. It could be totally random. There's plants just scattered across the landscape willy-nilly, or they could be grouped or contagious, which is or clumped. And this is in fact what we usually find. And then we talk about these different groups, and we need to describe them, be able to distinguish them from each other. So the physiognomy is one term that's been used, the general appearance of the plants, vegetation, then the flora. We have maps to show the vertical and horizontal distribution. We talk about associations and alliances, which are actually statistical correlations. And then we get to this interesting term we call the community. Okay, but let's go through here and just talk about physiognomy. It's a big word that really is probably the first, it describes the first thing we notice about plants. Are they trees, the shrubs, or herbs? And the category of herbs divided into the generally broad-leaved herbs we call forbs, and the narrow-leaved ones we call grasses, and also sedges and rushes and those things. And so we can notice that if we've got a bunch of trees, we've got a forest. If we've got a bunch of shrubs, we have shrubland, and so on and so forth. The other interest, so here we go. We've got, this is up at the upper left, obviously forest, this is the grassland, so shrubland. Okay, we go a little further into this. There's a really interesting old tradition started by the Danish botanist Runkiar, and he came up with a different way of looking at the forms of plants based on where was the tissue, the living tissue that survived from one year to the next. And basically, he would point out that if the buds are located high on shoots, that indicates that there's probably a very reliable, constant temperature and moisture regime with no difficult season of the year. There's no time when the plants are unusually stressed or threatened by heat or cold or drought or flood or fire or something like that. Interesting thing to think about. He came up with some diagrams showing where these different, what are these sites of these different perennial tissues. And very interesting thing, we could maybe have a whole discussion on that. I'll hold talk on that one time. Okay, vegetation is a word that's been used a lot in different ways. Once it was equivalent to physiognomy, now it's pretty much equivalent to plant life in general. The flora. What is flora? We talk about flora and fauna. In general, flora refers to plants, and then fauna refers to animals. But a flora in this specific sense is a list of species. And so we have the Marin flora, which is our sort of our Bible of plants here in Marin. And then we have floras. These are on the Marin CNPS website of different places, lists of plants in the county, species. Now, when we want to get to quantitative descriptions, let me go out and sample if we're only going to do a representative part, or we can actually census count every single plant out there. And that tells us something, gives us some numbers, but then the structure can only be revealed by really mapping in both vertical and horizontal dimensions. Here's a horizontal map, vertical map. Okay, the statistical association, which has been used a lot in the CNPS mapping program, looks at different plots and then tries to figure out statistically which species are most associated with each other more than they are with other species. And that constancy will lead to naming of an association or an alliance. And lots of wonderful work can be done in that area. It has been done. Okay, but getting beyond the description then, we get into the interesting question of what causes these groupings. And traditionally, there are a few that have been seen as more visible. I guess visible is not really maybe the best word, but soil. Wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever time of year you can see the soil, you can describe it and relate it to the plants perhaps. The climate and microclimate are pretty much known. Other invisible factors have become more studied, probably more recently, and these are the biological factors, living things that might be affecting each other in different ways that are not so obvious. The microclimate influences from a wonderful older book, had some great drawings in it, showing how here in the Bay Area, just simply the slope aspect will change the type of moisture, the levels of moisture and the types of plants that might be found in a particular area. The south-facing slopes are usually drier than the north-facing slopes, usually warmer, and therefore they tend to more have trees, have shrubs or grasses rather than trees, which we find on the north-facing slopes. If we look at what's beneath the surface, we see often abrupt changes in plants are caused by the soils that develop as a combination of the parent materials and the rocks and the action of the weather and the plants themselves. And so I think this is down there in further south, Monterey County. Okay, there is a problem that people, ecologists who love to discuss these things, have named the boundary problem. And this is that no matter where you draw the line between two groups of plants, there will always be some individuals of the same species on both sides of it. So can you really name the group at all? Can you really delineate it at all? And so some people question the reality of even trying to have discrete units. But that's wonderful if you want to have a good conversation with an plant ecologist, bring up the boundary problem question. Okay, now we get to the fun thing. So this is a topic really that we have here, community. In all of ecology, a community has been defined as a set of interacting populations of different species living at the same place in time, and this indicates that the members of a community are thought to have more ecological relationships with each other than with members of other communities. So we go through here and we see another definition that basically has the same meaning: a group of interacting species having similar tolerances and requirements in the present and a shared history in the past. We have the relationships within a community, the feeding relationships, the nutrient cycling relationships, the reproduction, and the abiotic or non-living influences. So the food web is a classic ecological diagram that shows how energy and nutrients pass from one individual to another as eating takes place. We have the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, all these things showing how these nutrients go back and forth between living and non-living parts of the environment. Reproduction, pollination, a fruit and seed dispersal. Ecological engineering, a forest will change the environment beneath it to make it more shady and moister. And then again, thinking about these emergent properties, we have the number of species, or species richness, we have the evenness, the quality of representation of species, the genetic diversity, the functional diversity, or the number of different species occupying different places in the food chains, and structural diversity. Forest will have a lot more diversity than grassland in that structural diversity. Now, what has led to a big discussion that's been very vigorous through the whole history of ecology in the United States, at least, is this question: do the patterns transcend the plant? So Frederick Clements, who was an early ecologist in Nebraska, he said, yes, the community is basically a super organism. It's just the same way that we are organisms. We start off with one cell, and then we grow, we mature, and we die. This community is a super organism. It starts off with an embryonic state, and then it continues to grow and develop and reach a climax, and then it disappears, perhaps. Gleason, ecologist, came along a little later, said, no, the community is simply an abstraction in our minds. It just results from the behaviors of its individual species that sort of randomly found themselves in the same place. So a lot of the discussion, the debate between these two schools of ecology, which in a way just sort of recapitulate the philosophical discussion or debate between the holistic view and the reductionist view. These discussions centered around succession, which is the orderly and predictable replacement of one set of species by another, or over time on the same site. So this goes back to some of Clements' original work. Powell's is a guy who actually preceded Clements in Chicago, near Chicago on the shores of Lake Michigan. Clements said, well, there's a series of stages. We call the ones that come before the last one seral, and the last one is the climax. And that's the ideal adult form of the community to which each community aspires. And then later, this is the 19th century, much later, these two ecologists, one from the United States, one from Australia, Connell and Slatcher, came up and they said, well, there are actually multiple pathways that could happen if you take into account the chance, the random events that can be part of any ecological system. And so we have the original Cowell's site of study. We have the classic primary succession from bare rocks, and this is what a lot of people in the northern hemisphere, far northern hemisphere, studied as glaciers receded and species succeeded each other, each one making the environment more favorable for the next stage and less favorable for itself. Okay, so change is going along secondary succession, where you don't just have bare rock, you have other species. And this is the complicated diagram of Connell and Slatcher. Basically, this is the traditional one. This is the one where the first species don't really make the situation better for the next one. They just tolerate them. And then inhibition is where they actually make it less favorable for the next one coming along. Okay, and then more recently, we've paid a lot of attention to what we call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that the maximum maximum diversity is maintained by periodic disturbances. So we may have a succession of the classic Clements model, and then there will be disturbance, grazing or fire or something, and then we'll have another set of successional stages, and then we'll have another disturbance. And the maximum diversity comes when we have a number of these patches at different stages on the landscape, different stages in this disturbance succession sequence. Of course, we have to measure things very carefully to determine what is intermediate. I mean, is this fire intermediate? This is a fire on Angel Island not too long ago. What type of grazing is intermediate? And then, of course, we have migration. There's been migration of communities in the past as climates have changed. And the big question is, can entire communities migrate in the future, actually in the present, as climate is changing more rapidly than it has in I guess, millions of years, right? Okay. Assuming that for the moment that we can use the term community, we could say, all right, here in Marin, we've got the ones that are on land, we've got the ones that are in the water, we've got the ones that are in between, intertidal, on the ocean shore or on the bay shore. And so you could come up with an interesting list here. The forests, again, thinking of where they are, and then also the general physiognomy, or the general appearance. You've got the forests made of trees, the woodlands made of more widely spaced trees, the shrublands made of shrubs, and then nobody actually uses the term herblands, but I think it's the only one I can use here to put all these things together. So then we can have those big categories and then divide them into smaller categories. Aquatic communities, again, we're not going to talk too much about these because most of them are not really strictly speaking dealing with plants. They're dealing more with algae and other things. But we do have our freshwater marsh, which could be considered an aquatic or semi-aquatic community. And then intertidal communities, the main one we can talk about is the salt marsh. And I guess the beaches too, to some extent. Okay, so here we are. This is Phoenix Lake. And if you can think about the groupings of plants, you might say, oh, I recognize several communities there. Let's see what they are. So one of the first ones that people often think about, because it has the tallest plants in it, is the North Coastal Coniferous Forest. And this is it one community or is it many communities? Play around a little bit here with the definition. Well, we know that this coniferous trees dominate in this community. And redwoods are some of those trees. Douglas firs are other trees in that community. We also have other conifers, Sargent cypress, bishop pine. We have these other trees. Does it make sense to define them as different communities if a lot of the understory species are the same? We have the sword fern going through this whole region of all these forests. Some of them are not, of course. The redwood sorrel tends to be found more under redwood. The redwood violet tends to be more under redwood as well. And then, of course, one of the things we can think about with respect to this community, because it has been a source of lumber, highly desired lumber for so long, there's been a lot of cutting. And that's been the main threat to this community throughout Western North America. We see the big stumps in areas such as Taylor Park, and this is in Baltimore Canyon, of what was once there. Another concern, once the trees were cut, and also maybe because of heavy grazing further upstream, we get a lot of entrenchment, erosion that has seriously eroded the creeks in this region. We have, of course, the wonderful attraction to all the tourists. This is one of the first, I guess you could say it's the first community in Marin that officially has had a quota system established, because Muir Woods has now a certain limit to the people who can come in, at least who can come in through cars, right? And so visitation, it can be a threat. A lot of times, it's not only the cars that are the symbols of or the agents of environmental degradation. Also, feet and bicycle tires and these other examples of people loving the parks to death, as they say. This can cause a lot of problems. Okay, we can't forget the animals of this community. The banana slug is also well distributed up and down the whole North Coast coniferous forest region. The salmon are thought to have historically been a major contributor to the nitrogen balance of the forest, as they would come up the rivers and spawn and then die, and their carcasses then would release the nitrogen back into the ecosystem, where they could be taken up by roots. Mixed evergreen forests. Well, this is interesting. Everything in moderation. Okay. Well, why do we say everything in moderation? Well, because it's hard really to pin down this exactly what the components are, except that there are many different kinds of trees. It's not always evergreen. There are some trees that, such as the winter deciduous oaks and the, I guess, summer deciduous buckeye, that are part of this community. It tends to occupy soils that are a little shallower and maybe higher up on slopes than the North Coast coniferous forest. The North Coast coniferous forest tends to be in valley bottoms with very deep soils. Some of the familiar species here, we have the coast live oak. We have, we did at least have the tan oak, California Bay laurel, the madrone, and the madrone. I put more pictures of madrone because this is was called by I think it was Howell's favorite tree, the author of the Marin Flora, and then of course the buckeye. The buckeye here has lost its leaves, and this may be summertime. The gray trees dying there are the tan oak trees, and they of course have been the most attacked by sudden oak death, but coast live oak and all the members of the black oak group have also been attacked. So it's been a serious threat to this particular community. And that's so sad. We'll move quickly on to the next one. Okay, oak woodland and savanna. So this is interesting. A savanna is a particular type of vegetation that has mostly grasses but widely spaced trees. Woodland has grass with more closely spaced trees, and then at some point it grades into forest, which is very closely spaced trees with perhaps no grasses. So the members of this community that are trees include some of the same members of the previous community. This is the valley oak. We do have coast live oak once again. And interesting enough, in the, we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about grasslands, especially towards the interior, where we have grasslands that are largely composed of annual grasses introduced from the Mediterranean region, we have a sharp difference between winter and summer. The winter hillsides are green, and the summer hillsides are very brown. However, that was not always the case. And in fact, in much of the North Bay, you can still see some very good examples of Festuca California, the California fescue, which is very much at home underneath oaks. Also a good idea for homeowners who want to plant something under their oak tree. These are probably, rather than valley oaks, these are probably, some of them are probably Gary oaks, or Oregon white oak. And another thing about this particular community is that it doesn't like to, it's generally not at the bottom of valleys, because that's where the fine textured soils are where water accumulates during the winter and their roots would be kind of flooded out. So they tend to be midway up the slopes. And we can't forget, thanks, I don't know if Christine's on here tonight, but we have to give thanks to Christine Jacob, who has been doing some wonderful artwork featuring not only our native plants, but our native fungi. And we can't forget the fungi because the chanterelle fungus is one of many at home in this particular community. Mycorrhizal, symbiont with oaks mostly, as Christine has shown so nicely here in this particular drawing. And many of the trees in these communities are linked together by mycorrhizal networks. We can't forget the other animals either. Of course, this is a famous one, right? The California endemic crown whitefly, Lycos live oak, and the bagworms, and of course the wonderful scrub jay, which plants a lot of our oaks. And so there's a wonderful symbiotic relationship there too. So the oak woodland in general has been studied a lot, and a lot of different diversity of many different groups, not only plants, not only insects, not only birds, mammals, everything, reptiles, amphibians, it's all there. And of course, grazing is another use of a lot of the oak woodland. And so the cows will often be seen there. A change to the oak woodland, which historically has been very well adapted to fire, has been the suppression of fire. This picture here shows something about to happen. So the leaves are oak leaves here, but wait a minute, there are also some other coniferous leaves, and this gives it away, the cones of the Douglas fir. So we're finding a lot in the North Bay here, in particular with fire suppression, is that the Douglas fir are moving in and displacing the oaks in a classic example of ecological succession, but one that's been speeded up a little bit by our suppression of fire. Now, if this is allowed to continue, then of course much of our oak woodlands could be replaced by Douglas fir forests. Other plants have come in as well, and Scotch broom, French broom. This is French broom. French broom has taken over a lot of, particularly southern and central Marin in the oak woodlands. And so, what are we doing to try to maybe save the oak woodland? Well, there are some controlled burns being done in many areas, and that is something that actually can return these oak woodlands to maybe a semblance of what they were before fire suppression started. Very successful program. The previous slide was from, I think, the Greater Ross Valley Field Break that's under construction right now, and then this is from China Camp, where there's a very early controlled burning program put into place. Interior grassland. Okay, this moves just slightly from what we were just talking about. This is the grass without the trees. And there's a lot of controversy about this. What is it or what was it? Well, again, Frederick Clements postulated that the interior grassland of California was dominated by purple needlegrass. However, he was making this statement years after most of it had been greatly transformed already, and he was just guessing from certain relict patches. It turns out the purple needlegrass is one of the bunch grasses that responds fairly well to disturbance, and so maybe that's why it persisted. A lot of people are saying that really this interior grassland was once not dominated by perennial grasses at all. Maybe it wasn't even dominated by grasses. We know that the California poppies and a lot of the other wildflowers that are still so abundant and impressive in many years were what really caught the eye of John Muir in the middle of the 19th century, when he said the whole Central Valley of California, one vast flower garden. So we're not sure exactly what was there before, but there's certainly still a lot of flowers, and maybe they dominated once upon a time. We know that there were grazing animals that were native to the interior grassland areas of California. This is actually a picture of the tule elk down in the area where they hung out the longest in the southern San Joaquin Valley. And what happened was with colonization, they were replaced with cattle, sheep, and goats. And then also all these and annual grasses were brought in. The wild oats are probably the most familiar, the largest. But we also had some clovers come in. We also had filleries come in. So these other annual plants have now dominated this interior grassland. And that's what we find. And generally speaking, what the, oops, let me go back here a minute. What we actually do find is that different ones of them will predominate in different years. The filiary predominates in years that are dry with early rain, because the filiary has deep taproot. The clover predominates when there's a cool year with a lot of rain, and the grasses predominate when there's moderate temperatures and a lot of moisture. Okay, serpentine grass, and very special. Unfortunately, I won't say too much about it, but go up to Ring Mountain right now, not right now, but this weekend perhaps, and you'll see all kinds of wonderful things up there. The serpentine grassland gets its name from the serpentinite rock, which is the state rock of California, a rock very punishing for most plants, very dry, weathers for very dry soil, also very high in toxic chemicals such as nickel, very low in useful chemicals that plants need, such as calcium. But there are certain plants that have evolved a special tolerance for this particular habitat. This isn't the one I wanted to put in there. This, I think, there are some special serpentine grasses. This may be actually the ryegrass, was it Elymus glaucus, ryegrassens, which was found on serpentine. But what we're probably talking about more this week in particular is the Tiburon mariposa lily, which is restricted to serpentine on the Tiburon Peninsula. We also have the beautiful jewel flower that is also restricted to the same habitat. So the wildflowers, and especially the rare and endangered ones that are part of this habitat, are of very special concern. And that's why, as Dave mentioned earlier, we're having this new program this year to help educate people about the wonderful jewels of this rare habitat. Coastal scrub and coastal prairie. Well, I put here they're kissed by fog. Of course, they get rained on too. But the coastal scrub is sometimes called soft chaparral, but it's very different from chaparral in that it's soft. Well, look at that's the fog. Okay, and where it's kissing is probably coastal scrub. The coastal scrub is usually found on soils that are not that deep, but there is soil. It's not just rocks. There's soil, and they tend to hold, the soils tend to hold water in the winter and spring months. And that's when the coastal scrub is most active. Famous members of this particular community would be the monkey flower, the coastal sagebrush. And what's we have to think about here is that and of course the coyote brush is there too. As the year goes on, this soil dries out relatively quickly. Some type of coastal scrub goes all the way down to Baja California. And as we get further south, the coastal sagebrush in particular can become summer deciduous and actually lose its leaves. And so that becomes a characteristic of this community as we go further south. And then what happens is that it waits until the next rains come along to rejuvenate itself, but it can these plants can hang out fairly well because of the fog influence. So the marine layer really does help these plants survive during the summer months. And there again is the coastal sagebrush. And the wonderful coyote brush. And it's interesting, the Golden Gates here, coastal scrub does go inland quite a ways into even the foothills of the Sierra Nevada at one point, where the delta breeze coming up through the Sacramento Valley, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta actually still moderates the climate. Coastal prairie is a grass-dominated community, but it also has a lot of these wonderful flowering forbs in it. It is also really in the area of fog influence, and there are different grasses than the ones that are common in the interior grasslands, and different flowering forbs as well. Of course, Chimney Rock at Point Reyes is the famous place to go to see this. I think this is the coastal hairgrass. Great place to see this particular community. And the star tulip here, or the pussy ears. Okay, contrast the coastal scrub with the chaparral. So the chaparral, really, the name comes from a Spanish word that means scrub oak, and oak is is one of the components. Scrub oaks are in the mix of plants in the chaparral. It's really a dwarf forest, though, as you might surmise from oaks being often trees as well. The stems are really hard. Now, as you fly over California, you can see this particular community in many areas. This is, I think, over the Central Coast Ranges, and down here, I think I have a pointer here. The southern slopes have chaparral on them. The northern slopes, you can see, have trees on them. And so, again, a very good example of the importance of the slope. Now, the big difference, one big difference, or mention one difference, is that the chaparral shrubs are woodier and thicker than the coastal scrub plants, and that's, I guess, where the cowboys got their chaps from. The need to protect their legs as they rode horses through this stuff. It's almost impenetrable. So, how is it that this particular plant formation or community can survive in the aridity and heat of the south-facing slopes throughout so much of California? And actually, it's actually active later into the spring and into the summer. Right now is the time the chamise is blooming, which is normally, there's a chamise blooming there, is kind of a dry time on Mount Tamalpais. Chamise, we also have manzanitas, and this is this is the manzanita root on Mount Tamalpais. Usually the chaparral soils are not that much soil, not just soil, there's a lot of rock in them. or actually the chaparral roots can penetrate down into pockets in the rock where water accumulates and can be accessed later in the year after, for example, the thin soils of the coastal scrub have lost most of their moisture. And there it is, the beautiful chamise, and it should be in bloom right now. I haven't checked. Should be on Mount Tam. And again, several species of chaparral of manzanita are very common in the chaparral. Usually, the chamise is an indicator of the driest part of the chaparral, and the manzanita is somewhere in between. Ceanothus, many different species, usually indicates like moisture variant of the chaparral. And when I was first studying this in my early years in college, I was told that the chaparral was a formation that was designed to burn. It had to burn, and it is true that it burns, and it burns hot, and it also has many adaptations to recover from burns. The burls that are at the bottom of many of the species of the manzanitas, the seeds that germinate only after exposure to heat and smoke. So there is a lot of adaptation to fire that can be seen in these plants. However, more recently we've become aware of the fact that actually we may be getting too frequent fires in much of California that is gradually converting chaparral into grassland. And this is from Southern California. On Mount Tamalpais, we still probably have the legacy of fire suppression. But and this is how we can sort of tell that here. Of all things, on the this is, I think, on the south side of Mount Tam, we have madrones, we have manzanitas, we have other plants that show that they have, from their outspread branches, the more open form, that when they were young, these other coniferous trees were not here. And probably fire maintained the open aspect of that vegetation for many years until it was suppressed, and these coniferous trees here, they're actually redwoods, began to come in. Okay, what about the beaches and dunes for something totally different? Well, not actually that different at all, because even though the chaparral is a very different type of plant formation, it is considered to be one that does well in a very dry environment, and the environment of the beaches and dunes is actually very dry as well. Not so much because of the climate, although rainfall may not be that high. There is a lot of fog to keep it moist. There are also winds that dry it out, and there's also a lot of sand that does not hold moisture. So here we have a very dynamic environment. I put here changing patterns on the sand. The plants here, to a large extent, have a lot of adaptation to moving sand. This is, and there's zonation in this community that can reveal this. So here is, I think this may be up at the northern tip of the Point Reyes. This is probably near Dillon Beach, I think. Shows a view looking inland, actively moving sand in the foreground, and then the back, very stabilized sand. A lot of people say there's a fossil sand near the Pleistocene. And then there can be variation or gradations in between. What we have right next to the beach on the actively moving sand is usually a set of plants that can tolerate sand burial, often called sand mat vegetation. Here we have the sand verbena, yellow sand verbena, the beach sagebrush, and we may have some strawberries in there, but maybe not. And then as we begin to go back to areas where the sand has become more stabilized, we have the different kinds of bush lupin, in particular the Lupinus arboreus, Lupinus gemmisonus, or the beach heather. We may get some of the coastal buckwheat. And generally, what we think happened before humans started changing the environment here was that throughout the California coast, up and down the California coast, we had a series of dunes that paralleled the prevailing winds from the northwest to the southeast. And there was a constant replenishment of sand from the beach. It would blow inland, bury dunes that had been stabilized, and then the plants that were adapted to the moving sand would get a foothold. Gradually there'd be a succession to the plants that were larger, more shrub-like, and would stabilize the dunes, and the cycle would repeat. What happened though, well, let's first of all show some beautiful plants that are very much adapted to this actively moving sand environment, or the actively moving sand zone, often called the foredune zone. This is our beach leia, one of our rare and endangered plants, is one of the tarweed tribe. And again, it shows, as does the sand verbena, another dune plant characteristic of succulent leaves. And this needs the actively moving sand. If the sand becomes stabilized, it won't be able to compete with the other plants, and it'll be crowded out. One of the most famous plants, because of a wonderful story that's been worked out by folks from Washington University in St. Louis, the Tyestrum's lupin. And again, what you can see if you look at the Tyestrum's lupin is that it's on the ground. It's pretty much on the ground. It has its fruits and seeds right on the ground. And one of the things this group worked out was that the introduction of grasses that stabilized the dunes also gave more cover to native rodents that then ate the seeds all up and made this much more of an endangered plant. But we have, of course, a lot of wonderful insects in the dunes. This is the sun moth, a Lithariopteryx, that mines the leaves of the sand verbena, and it's a beautiful little moth, very small thing. And the marsh fly. Now, there's some interesting stories I hear too related to the sand. The marsh fly actually, like a lot of flies, can live on liquefying waste when it's young, perhaps. But here's a little beetle. Okay, so this is a clown beetle, Spilodiscus, and it feeds on, what does it feed on? It can feed on a fly like the marsh fly, but it feeds on flies that feed on decaying vegetation, plant material that has been killed by blowing sand. So it also is dependent on the blowing sand. We also have some of the bees, the Melissodes here, a longhorn bee, that of course lives on pollen and nectar, but then requires this particular texture of sand to make its burrows. That's where it nests. And so you see it there on I think, Grindelia. It's very partially Grindelia. It has a lot of Grindelia pollen over here. And then there are other predators, such as the sand wasp, that make their nests in the sand here too. This is a mother sand wasp making her burrow here, and she has to catch caterpillars then and take them in there. And actually, not caterpillars. This particular wasp takes flies, adult flies, and feeds her young. This is another wasp, but it's a parasite that, in fact, is going to parasitize other wasps. Okay. And what has happened to this particular community is that, I guess the biggest tragedy is that invasive plants have been unfortunately introduced. This is the native beach ryegrass, which shows how when it's growing normally, it leaves lots of patches in between it of bare sand. And other plants that are accustomed to this bare sand can find a foothold. What's happened is that the introduced European beach grass has pretty much pushed everything else out over large parts of the California coast, and it makes these this is still filling in impenetrable hummocks, which change the entire architecture of the dunes from a northwest southeast facing set of dunes to a wall that parallels the coast and is perpendicular to the prevailing winds. Ice plant, the South African ice plant, also has pretty much crowded out a lot of the native plants. So real need here for constant vigilance to remove the invasive plants. Coastal salt marsh, like the dunes, is an area where there are big changes in very small places over very small distances. And that's because of the tidal variation each day. We have 2 high tides and 2 low tides on our coast every day. Therefore, they divide the day into 4 parts, about 6 hours long each. And the overall elevation gain is not that great. The overall elevation difference in the salt marsh is not very great. So just a little bit of change in the tidal fluctuation can cause a big change in the marsh. So basically, what we have here is cordgrass at the lowest level. We have gum plant at the highest level. And in between, we have pickleweed, saltgrass. Probably the most diverse level is the mid-level of the marsh. Below the marsh, you have mudflats. And this is China Camp, I think, showing what are considered to be relatively new salt marshes deposited from the sediment that was the result of hydraulic mining during the gold rush. So the cordgrass is very productive. I'll put some figures here in to show how much leaf material it can produce. Less than redwood, yes, but it's getting there. Okay. And then we have pickleweed, also very, very productive. And the gum plant is higher up. Now, what happens is that because the tides are of different heights at different times of the month, there are some areas of the marsh that may be flooded only once a month. There are some areas that may be only dry once a month. So the gum plant is on the drier edge, the driest edge of the salt marsh, and the cordgrass is on the wet side. Okay, so once again, a major concern of conservationists in terms of the salt marsh is the introduction of certain invasive cordgrasses, plus other invasive plants as well. The Atlantic cordgrass can grow lower than the Pacific cordgrass, and therefore can convert mudflats into stands of Atlantic cordgrass. And this can eliminate the foraging areas for a lot of our birds, because they need the invertebrates that live in the mudflats, in the mud itself, in the mudflats. And then we also have the Chilean cordgrass, which can grow higher. And this can eliminate then that very rich mid-marsh habitat. Of course, the biggest threat probably to salt marshes throughout the whole state of California, I guess, well, the California coast, is urbanization. There's been a lot of fill. This is, I think, near the San Francisco airport. And a new concern, there's been fill here too, this is Corte Creek. A new concern is that with climate change and rising sea levels, the urbanization and the other changes that people have made along a lot of the historic salt marsh have pushed the salt marsh into a corner, so to speak, and where you have this very, very abrupt change from the lowest edge of the marsh, the lowest part of the marsh, to the area that's no longer marsh, it's above tidal action, that is going to be transformed rapidly by rising sea levels. And so the plants and animals that live at in the different zones are not going to be able to sort themselves out slowly as they could where there was, or where there still is, a more gradual incline. And of course, there are a lot of animals that are endangered that live in the salt marsh. This is the wonderful salt marsh harvest mouse. We also have the Ridgway's rail, and so salt marsh is also a very important habitat to protect. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is just come back to our basic question: do plant communities exist? Well, you can decide that. I think maybe there are some more important questions, and let's get to those. So, in terms of conservation, if we want to save these particular groupings of plants and animals and fungi and everything else that they contain, these places contain, at what level should we focus our conservation efforts? The Federal Endangered Species Act that was enacted in the 1970s, and also the California Endangered Species Act, focused people's attention on individual species. But if we're really thinking about this community concept, the idea that plants occur in groupings, that different species that interact, and they also interact with fungi and animals and all these other forms of life, then maybe we should actually pay attention to the groupings that are endangered as much as individual species. And to some extent, I think state CNPS has been doing this with its mapping programs, mapping different alliances and associations, trying to point out which ones are particularly endangered in California. And I guess the question that I bring up here is, what about the endangered interactions? Maybe that's really what we have to focus on, especially as with climate change, different species may respond differently to the increasing temperatures, and also, of course, to the rising sea levels. Okay, what are we going to focus on? We can decide. Okay, instead of the end, I thought I'd put the beginning, because I think traditionally this was just the beginning of the course, and also it's the beginning of all of our wonderful work to conserve these different plants and their habitats. And so, bye-bye. Thanks. Now I can take some questions. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. Not only to have a description of the communities, but the some of the dynamics affecting them and the threats affecting them for us to ponder. There are several comments and questions in the chat. Ann Libben says seagrasses are important in Marin. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Oh, definitely, seagrasses are important, and I think that's where we do get into the actual subtitle area. And so if we're thinking about eelgrass beds and all over in different parts of the county, of course, Richardson Bay has gotten the most attention, but other areas as well. And I guess I just wasn't able to cover all the plants, but I just did see that I think it was in the news earlier this week, or maybe the end of last week, that there's a major new grant from the Environmental Protection Agency that's going to be funneled through the San Francisco State University's Romberg Institute to do eelgrass restoration. And eelgrass in particular are important for the places for fishes to deposit eggs and those things. So yes, wonderful. Those are thank you for that reminder.
And James Price has a question about keynote species. Is it still appropriate to think of some plants acting as keynote species as shaping biotic communities? It's a concept I learned in grade school, but not sure what the current thinking is. The one example that comes to mind is the tan oak that acidifies the soil and thus promotes the growth of many members of the Ericaceae and fungal allies, the Cantharellacea.
Right. Well, thanks very much, James, and congratulations for having gone to a great grade school. I'm so happy to know that somebody was teaching about keystone species at that time. I think it still is very appropriate. So I think one of the ideas that I've been coming to, I can sort of say that maybe when it was fashionable to be a Clemensian, I was a Gleasonian, and maybe now that it's become more fashionable to become a Gleasonian, now I'm a Clemensian. But anyway, to get away from that controversy of the reductionist or holistic approach to communities, we can actually focus on the interactions. And so maybe communities are actually nodes of particularly strong interactions, and therefore those particular members of the community that have the strongest interactions with the largest number of other species would be justly considered keystone species. And the name, of course, comes from the architectural feature of the arch. And if one has to have the keystone there, or the whole arch will fall apart. So I think the tan oak is certainly an important species that has it has become very, very scarce because of sudden oak death. And the chanterelles in that family certainly are important, but many of them can also form relationships with some of the other oaks. So, but yes, I remember talking to one plant pathologist and mycologist who said the tan oak support an incredible number of different fungal species. So yes, I think it's still appropriate to think of keystone species. I think it's particularly sad that we're losing some of them, and maybe there's going to be a way someday that we can restore them.
Yeah. Kevin Sherrill question says, great talk. I will mention Spartina hybrids are the main concern. The species mentioned hybridized with Spartina foliosa, Spartina alterniflora, exfoliosa hybrid is also in the mid to upper marsh.
That's true. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so there's been some great work to eliminate the hybrids, and that's not been an easy thing because they've had to do DNA analysis to really confirm which are the hybrids. And so once they've identified them, they have been able to get rid of them. So there's been some success in that area. There's I should mention there's the invasive Spartina project. That I think has I forget what its website is, probably invasivespartina.org or something like that, that has a lot of information on the efforts to, many of them very successful, to eliminate the invasive Spartina hybrids, the species and their hybrids. Yeah.
And I would just add to that the Spartina project spoke to us in Marin. I don't know the exact month, but you can look for it on our YouTube channel. The video of that program is there if you're interested. Wendy Schmidt asks, what's an example of an endangered interaction?
So I think the endangered interactions that have attracted the most attention are probably the pollination interactions and the mycorrhizal interactions. So probably the one that was just mentioned with tan oaks and some of the the chanterelle fungi might be a mycorrhizal example. With pollination, what people are concerned about, and we're not sure exactly which ones are most endangered right now. What the concern is that, especially in California, where we have a lot of solitary bees that are only active for maybe as adults for a couple of weeks each year, and they're very tightly, some of them are tightly connected to certain plant species that may only bloom for a couple of weeks each year. What happens as the climate warms? Will they be able to migrate together? Will they respond to the warming climate in the same way, or will one of the members of the pair move faster or disappear from an area faster than the other one? And in that case, the members of the interaction will become uncoupled from each other. And if there's a strong dependency on both sides, both may disappear. So that's probably a great example of an endangered interaction. We're not sure exactly which ones are the most endangered. That's why I'm suggesting maybe we need to focus a little more on that.
Nona Dennis asks, how do you explain the high degree of specialization in Manzanita genus compared to chemise, which has only one species across similar landscapes in California?
Well, I'm not sure I can actually not sure I can answer that question, Nona. We did, I think, I'm not sure whether we had a talk comparing Manzanita to Madrone, which is actually in the same family. And the idea is that the Manzanitas were responding to a new set of microclimates, whereas the madrones were still persisting in a moist, relatively more moist microclimate that has been in California long before the drying trend of the late Pleistocene and later, or actually maybe actually begun as much as 1 million years ago. But in terms of chamise, I'm not really sure. I don't know whether it, there's something about the genetic variability or that was there for it to be selected from. That's a very good question. The person to ask that question to is Tom Parker over at San Francisco State.
Yeah, right.
Nona, do you have an additional question?
Well, no, just to add to that, because there's some 90 species, subspecies, varieties, Manzanita, that's not limited to California, but high degree of plasticity across California. And it's always been fascinating to me that chamise occupies really essentially the same niche. And yet there is only one genus, one species that has persisted throughout California. So, and even on Montana, there are some very distinct patches of species of Manzanita, Montana, and so I won't go into it, but it's a fascinating thing to pursue. And at some point, it's certainly a genetic plasticity, I think.
That's a great question, and it's interesting because I never thought of that question. So thanks for bringing that up. The question that I had in my mind for many years is because they're in the same family. Why is it there's only one species of madrone, or maybe two if you include?
Well, that's a thought too.
Yeah, and there's so many species of Manzanita, and I think that Tom Parker in one of the talks he gave, or Mike Vasey,
yeah, Mike Vasey.
Then they actually did come up with that hypothesis that when the Mediterranean climate began to appear in California, the madrones retreated to the areas where it was still more moist, and the Manzanitas evolved the tolerance to the drier climates, and that's why we got more Manzanitas. But
yeah, right.
Yeah, but that's great. Well, we'll see which one of us gets to ask Tom.
Okay, we'll see which one finds the.
Okay.
Actually, the other person who might be a good person to ask would be Bruce Baldwin, because he's worked out that whole thing of the speciation of the tarweeds into the Hawaiian silver source.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's
okay. All right, good.
Well, that's all the questions in the chat. If any of you have a question you'd like to or comment you'd like to make live, please you could raise your hand and unmute. Well, Paul, I have one about the question of synergy. Has much research been done on the synergistic aspects of the plants, of plant communities? I mean, you referred to the mycorrhizae. But
the plants themselves, I guess, synergistic. That would be interesting. I think it's most of what I have learned is that it's sort of one way in the coniferous forest with the ecological engineering. Certainly, the sword ferns and all of the understory plants rely on the upper overstory trees for shade and moisture. The one area where I think maybe synergy has been explored a little bit among plants, and that's kind of interesting, is in the oak woodland, when the oak trees bring up nutrients and water from lower soil horizons, and then bring them up, of course, into their leaves, and the leaves fall down and then enrich the grasslands. And then so maybe that's one area, but that's a very good question. Synergy among the plants. Yeah. I have to think about that a little more.
Okay. Well, Paul, thank you so much. What a really wonderfully informative presentation. And before we leave, I'd like to tell you about the program next month. Paul talked about those salt marshes that are pushed into a corner. Next month discusses probably the classic Marin salt marsh that has been pushed into a corner, Bothine Marsh. And Rob Laporte and the GGNRA and Veronica Pearson from Marin County Parks are going to be talking about the restoration plans including the multi-use path that there have been several proposals for. So that's on tap for our July meeting. And so we look forward to seeing you then. So thanks for coming, and we hope to see you in a month.